come from a long line of farmers, actually two long lines. On my mom's side of the family, there were farmers from Montana. As the story goes, my great-grandfather walked from Missouri all the way to Montana in the 1860s. And at first, he was a bullwhacker. I had to look that up because I didn't know what a bullwhacker was, but it was someone who whacks bulls. And so he would get a team of oxen and drive carts led by bulls all over, I guess at the time, Montana territory on these little rugged trails and roads. And eventually he ended up in this little place called Confederate Gulch. And the reason it's called Confederate Gulch is because Confederate soldiers, quite a few of them actually, ended up there towards the end of the Civil War. Well, my great-grandmother, Minnie, happened to be part of one of the original families from Confederate Gulch, we think. But Finley, my grandfather, Finley McClintock, great-grandfather, and Minnie Parker, my great-grandmother, married in 1893 and tried to make a living in this little tiny valley on the western slopes of Montana's Big Belt Mountains. Now, just a little bit of history. Confederate Gulch used to be a hopping place. There was probably more gold found there than in any other place in Montana. And in the mid-1860s, like 1864, 1865, in that time frame, there were about 1/3 of all people living in Montana living in Confederate Gulch. It was crowded, it was packed, but by the time that my great-grandparents got married, the gold was gone, and there was just a few dozen families left in Confederate Gulch, and it wasn't good farmland. So Finley started looking around Montana and realized that in Carbon County, where the Crow Reservation was, the government was basically giving away land for people to come and homestead. So he got 80 acres right on Rock Creek, Montana, in the little town of Rockvale, and Rock Creek was the creek that went through it, and it was amazing farmland. So he went first because there was nothing there, and he traveled many miles bringing logs down from the forest to build a little 2-bedroom log cabin. And eventually, my great-grandmother and the 3 small children that she had at the time joined him on the farm. Pretty soon, about 9 months later, I think, my grandmother was born. And she loved farming. It was in her blood. It was just something about planting things and watering them and watching them grow. She wanted to grow up to be a farmer, and she was told by everyone over and over and over and over and over again, girls don't grow up to be farmers. Uh-oh, that was not a wise thing for them to tell my grandmother if you ever knew her. She was determined to be a farmer. And because there was no high school within miles of Rockvale, she actually packed her bags and moved about 200 miles away to a town where she knew somebody so she could go to high school there because she wanted to go to Montana State College in Bozeman and study farming, agriculture. Well, she was told, well, you'll never get in. There's never been a woman that's ever applied to the program before. But Alice, my grandmother, applied and was the first woman to graduate with an agriculture degree from Montana State in Bozeman. Farming was just, like I said, in her blood. This is my grandmother who spent 10 years on Hawaii after spending time on the Big Island, after spending time on Native American reservations in Montana, in farming communities, helping women and children and farmers. When she was here, she was actually on the board of the farm fair, and she worked with people in the various plantation camps on the island back in the 40s and 50s, and also was in charge of 4-H for girls on the island. Like I said, farming was just a part of who she was. Most of you know the story of my father and where he came from the book that I wrote about it and also from some other sermons, but just in a nutshell, my dad came from farmers on the Big Island, and they were known as the Maka'ainana. And Maka'ainana are known today as the common people, and in some dictionaries, when you look up the word in the Hawaiian English Dictionary, Maka'ainana, it simply says commoner. And I'll never forget when I asked my Auntie Dot, Auntie, is there any chance we have any royal blood in our veins? And she just gasped and said, oh no, we are common people. We have always been common people. And I will never forget those words and the expression on her face of just fear that I would think that we are from Aligi. So I let that go. But if you look up the actual meaning of Maka'ainana, it means literally keeping eyes on the land. And the Maka'ainana were the proud people who knew that they were a part of the land and connected to the land, and their job was to make sure that the land was cared for, and they were the ones who farmed the land because they knew if they didn't take care of the land and be good stewards of the land and plant things in the proper time, in the proper amounts, in the proper seasons, that the land wouldn't provide for their needs and sustain them and their families, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the future. The Maka'ainana were the farmers and the fishers, both the fishermen and the fisherwomen. But most importantly, they were the ones who kept their eyes on the land. By the time I was born, my parents had moved from the Big Island to the suburbs of the San Francisco Peninsula. Back then, it was just a little community called Menlo Park that hardly anybody had ever heard of, way before Facebook moved in. So, in those days, it was just a nice, quiet little suburb with no farms for miles around, at least none that we were aware of. My grandmother, Alice, after moving from Montana to Big Island and then Kauai and then India, ended up moving right almost next door, the next town over in Palo Alto. And again, it was just a suburb, no farms for miles around. But I'm going to tell you something about both my parents and my grandmother. They always had gardens. My parents had a wonderful vegetable garden, and they also grew fruit trees. But they took care of vegetables and taught me as a very young boy how to plant a seed in the ground and water it and make sure I took care of the weeds and watch it grow. My grandmother, on the other hand, by that time, she was in her 60s and she was done farming. She'd had enough of that finally, but she loved her flower gardens, and she had some of the most amazing flowers growing in her gardens, in the front yard, in the side yard, in the backyard. And she also taught me the importance of planting the seeds in the right places with the right soil, pouring the right amount of water, and watching them grow. And I remember, as a child, just being fascinated with the idea that you could plant something so small you couldn't even see it from where some of you were sitting if I was holding it up. And if I just watered it, it would grow into this wonderful thing. And it didn't matter to me if it was tomatoes or sunflowers. It was just wonderful watching things grow and knowing that I had something to do with it. I find it fascinating that in this morning's Old Testament lesson that Jeannie read for us, that Isaiah says that the kind of worship that God really likes is like a well-watered garden. Imagine that. What we are doing here for this hour is being a garden and allowing ourselves and God to water us so that we can flourish and be healthy and thrive. I remember one week when we left, and it was in the summertime, and we forgot to ask somebody to water our garden for us. So when we got back, I thought everything was dead. Everything was drooping over. It just looked horrible. And I think it was my mom, maybe my mom and dad, said, if we just water it right away, it'll be okay. And I couldn't imagine this garden coming back to life. But within just a few days, it looked almost as vibrant as it did when we left it. So as I think about us and what it means that we can be a well-watered garden, it doesn't really matter if we came to church this morning just to feel like we're thriving and happy and joyful and full of energy, or if we've come kind of dry, like we just haven't had enough water for a while. This time together on Sunday morning is a time for you to be watered. So I invite you just to feel that water and what it means to you and what it feels like to you. Isaiah made it pretty clear what kind of worship God considered a well-watered garden he was very specific. It's the kind of worship where we learn to show compassion. And Isaiah makes it clear what it means to have compassion. And basically, he doesn't call it this, but what he's talking about is the compassion of mission and the compassion of justice. Mission is when you see somebody who's hurting and you help them. Justice is when you look at the root causes that cause the pain, why the person's suffering and hurting, and you do something about it so that people aren't hurting in the first place. And it's a part of our rich Judeo-Christian heritage that we show compassion of mission and we show compassion of justice. Isaiah talks about feeding hungry people, loosening the bonds of injustice, helping people who are homeless by providing a home, helping people who don't have clothes by providing clothing. He makes it really simple. Basically what he's saying is, look around you, look in your neighborhoods, in your communities, look within your church even. Think about what someone might be missing that might be causing the pain and suffering, and help them out. But he does go beyond that and talks about justice and oppression. It's both, and it's always been both. And we can't just say, as the Christian church, we're going to work on a vision for the future. We're not going to help people now. We're just going to work on our vision. And when we get there, then we're going to help people. We need to help people right now, whenever we see somebody who's suffering. But we also need to be thinking, what are the causes of hunger on our island? What are the causes of homelessness in our state? What are the causes of people not having enough clothes in our nation and in the world? And actually looking at those root causes and together doing something about it. Not just saying, oh, that's for the politicians, or that's for some other group. It's a part of what we all do. And Jesus, I want you to know, was always about the mission, the compassion of mission, and the compassion of justice. And he addressed both in this morning's gospel lesson. And in that lesson, he's in the synagogue. And in walks a lady. We think she walked in, but we're not even sure about that because she has been so crippled for 18 years that she can't even stand up straight. So she may have crawled in. She may have had to have been carried in. What we do know is that she was suffering, and we are told that because of some kind of spiritual condition, she had this physical condition. Because, as we're told in the gospel, it was because of a spirit she was like that. So what do you do when you have a spiritual condition that you want to be addressed? You come to church, that's one way. But imagine going to church and having people totally ignore you. That's what happened to this woman. She was ignored because she wanted to be healed on the Sabbath. And this gets to the justice part of it. She was told, you can't really be healed on the Sabbath because that's against our rules. We consider healing work, and you can't work on the Sabbath. So this may have been her first trip, or she may have been going to church for 18 years to her synagogue and being told, not today, not today, not today. And Jesus happened to be there this time, and he said, I'll heal you. And suddenly, he freed her from that spiritual condition that was causing the physical condition. And that reminds me that our physical bodies are connected to our spirits as well. But Jesus healed her, and he knew, he had to have known, he was going to get some feedback from the people that were there, the religious leaders. And that he did. And they scolded him and basically said, how dare you work on the Sabbath? That's against our rules. You know better than that. And Jesus basically said, you know what, we've got a justice problem here, don't we? He didn't say those words. But that's actually what he was saying. Because he said, you know what, every one of you has animals, and you certainly untie your ox and your donkey on the Sabbath to make sure that it's free to get the water that it needs to survive. That's work. You work on the Sabbath. how much more important is this child of God than your donkey or your oxen? And after that, nobody argued with Jesus about that point anymore. You see, he not only helped the woman, but he addressed the root causes that were causing her suffering in the first place. And that's the kind of worship where God says, you are like a watered garden when you show compassion for other people. And we here who live on the garden island should know that better than anyone else. We are the garden. Our whole island is a garden. Everywhere you look, how can you not say, wow, how beautiful and how fortunate we are to live in this place? And to talk about being a well-watered garden, Mount Waialeale is known as the wettest spot on earth, and it's just up the mountain here. We should understand this better than anybody else. But yet, I'm puzzled because on this island, there are hungry people. There are people who are suffering because they don't have a house or a home. And there are people who don't have adequate clothing, and there are people who are lonely, and people who are discouraged, and people who are depressed, and people who need people to show compassion to them. So, do you want to feel like a well-watered garden? If you do, it's pretty simple how God, according to God's Word, how to do that. We open our eyes and we look not only in this room for people who are suffering, but we look out there. We look all around us and we look. And when we see people who are suffering, we alleviate their suffering in whatever way we can. And we address the root issues of what causes the suffering in the first place. I hope that we do that both for people as well as for the Aina, the land, because we too can have compassion for the land, just like the native people have done for these lands for many, many centuries. And for the vine, the water that nourishes us. We should care for the water. We must care for the water, because if the water's bad, we can't water the garden. And for the kai, the ocean, where most of our seafood and our fish come from. Caring for all of it. Even kalani, the air that we breathe, the heavens and the sky. Our job as the garden and the gardeners is to care for it all, so that all of God's creatures, including us, will be healthy and vibrant and full of life and energy, just like a well-watered garden. My hope and prayer and my invitation to you today is when you leave this place, actually even before you leave this place, to look around you and see who might need a little bit of that water. Because that's who we are. We're the ones who water one another. And also look around and see places where the earth and the sky and the streams and the ocean might need some compassion as well. I think we're pretty lucky here, pretty fortunate, because everywhere we look, we are reminded of this amazing garden. And I hope when you're reminded this week of this wonderful garden, this island that we live on, that you will think, how can I help be a co-gardener with God, and water wherever the watering needs to be watered. Amen.